Hello, everyone. Welcome to an Americans for Limited Government live stream. I'm really happy today to be joined by a very special guest, Chris Edwards. He's the Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Thank you very much, Chris, for joining us and sharing your expertise with us today.
Thanks a lot, Catherine.
So you've been looking into the Build Back Better bill. This is the measure that it's right now. I mean, it keeps sort of going back and forth, but it's at 1.85 trillion. It was scaled down from a proposed 3.5 trillion. This would be the third of Joe Biden's massive spending bills since he took office, if it were to pass. And you've been looking at what's in it in terms of tax policy and spending, how they want to pay for it all. And you wrote that there is a lot of gimmicky accounting in this bill. Why don't you explain a little bit about what that means?
So thanks again for having me. The Democrats just passed $1 trillion infrastructure bill, which was vastly bloated, and now they're moving to their so-called Build Back Better plan. The centrist think tank Committee for Responsible Federal Budget came out with an analysis the other day saying that, although the sticker price of the new plan is $2.4 trillion over 10 years, it would actually cost probably $4.9 trillion, twice as much over 10 years. And that's because a lot of the proposed new programs, the Democrats pretend to only fund for a year or two. But if you pass a program for only a year or two, that there's going to be big pressure to extend it into the future. And so the Democrats are using this sort of fake accounting to try to appease some of the centrists, such as Senator Joe Manchin, to try to get this vastly bloated bill passed. And so hopefully some of the centrist senators will see through this and realize, we just can't afford this sort of gigantic bill.
And is it my understanding that some of the centrist Democrats in the Senate were waiting for the Congressional Budget Office to score the bill? Has that score come in? And
so the Congressional Budget Office has not scored the whole bill yet. My understanding is maybe Friday or Saturday they're going to be scoring it, and then the House now says that it'll vote on the weekend. I think on this, but these congressional leaders always set these time frames, and then they can't get their stuff together and deadlines pass. So I hope this doesn't pass at all. We don't need more spending from Washington, as you know, Catherine. So but the Congressional Budget Office score will throw hopefully a little bit more budget reality and accounting reality on the debate here in Washington.
Okay, I'm putting up a screen here. Hopefully we're seeing it. This is a recent blog you wrote, 10 downsides to the Democratic spending plan. And you detail in this piece here that it's not just the money itself that's problematic, but all sorts of other impacts. And you talked about the formula for any time the federal government spends money, it actually is pulling money out of the private sector. What is that sort of basic formula?
Well, one of the things that's always forgotten in Washington debates is that taxes cost the private sector much more than the sort of nameplate dollar value of the increase. So the federal government increases private sector taxes by, say, $1 billion. It actually costs the private sector about $1.5 billion because of the damage created by extracting all these taxes out of the economy. Economists call this deadweight losses. There's also compliance or paperwork costs of tax hikes too. So, the government increases your taxes, you get a lot of extra paperwork costs sometimes, as well as it'll change your behavior. The government tries to extract money out of a small business. The small business may invest more. The owner may work less. So those are the sort of the collateral damage of tax hikes. So again, the basic rule is that the government extracts $1 out of the private sector economy. It actually costs the private sector economy $1.50. And that extra collateral damage is often forgotten in Washington policy debates.
You're right about that. My husband and I own, in addition to my work here at Americans for Limited Government, we own a small business. And so we're constantly feeling the impact of these government regulations and taxes. And you're right, it does cause investors and business owners to change their behavior to keep up with what the government is doing. And so, absolutely, I know that firsthand. Another thing you wrote about is that states can do it. So, in other words, a lot of what is addressed in this bill are things that states either are already doing or can do, and usually much more efficiently than the federal government.
That's right. There's nothing in the $1 trillion infrastructure bill that already passed or this new $4.9 trillion Build Back Better plan that state governments couldn't do themselves if they wanted to. I mean, just to take one example, the Democrats have a new national paid leave program in their Build Back Better plan. But 7 or 8 states already have these programs themselves. I'm not in favor of the government doing paid leave, but if we're going to have it, it's better if state governments do it, because then state governments, they're more fiscally restrained and they can learn lessons from each other and they can modify these programs if they don't work. And states that don't want these programs don't have to enact them. So it's enormously arrogant for the federal government to come in and say, we're going to impose top down on all 50 states a new national paid leave program, new pre-K programs, new child care programs, force the expansion of Medicaid in every state. It's hugely arrogant, and it doesn't do American citizens any good. People in a lot of states, more conservative states perhaps, don't want a lot of these new government programs. So why should the federal government be forcing it on every state? The great strength of America is that it's supposed to be a decentralized federation, which allows for diversity. People in New York and Texas are different. So let the state legislatures, enact programs and set tax levels that are appropriate for their residents. There's no need for all this top-down control from Washington.
Something else that you talked about in your piece is that we're experiencing federal overload. You noted that the federal government's budget is on average 150 times larger than a state's annual budget. So clearly, I mean, there's just no proportion to the states. They're running a much more lean operation in many or maybe most instances compared with the federal government's bloated operation. Why would we want to enlarge that, right?
That's right. The federal government already runs 2,300 different subsidy programs, if you can believe it. It's absolutely extraordinary. And then the number of these subsidy programs keeps increasing decade after decade. Obviously, Congress is supposed to oversee that these programs work well and that there isn't too much fraud and that sort of stuff. But of course, they don't have time. Most members of Congress are too busy raising money or getting involved in, idiotic political debates. They don't have time to oversee the programs they already have, let alone add new ones. I mean, we saw last year, for example, with a lot of the pandemic handout programs, that there's a huge amount of fraud and waste in these programs. Congress didn't hardly even bothered to deal with the fraud and waste in these programs we already have. So one startling statistic is that if you take sort of an average sized state like where I live in Virginia, the state budget is about $45 billion. Well, federal spending is now almost $7 trillion. So it's about 150 times greater than spending in the average sized budget. So, you can imagine a state legislature in Virginia, they run a reasonably tight ship. The members of the legislature have time to oversee the programs. There's just no way in hell that members of Congress have time to oversee even half of the programs that they already have, let alone adding new ones.
Chris, you are right about that. And I put up the name of your, you run a news blog, is it? Downsizinggovernment.org, which sounds perfect for our people, our audience here at Americans for Limited Government. We're all about downsizing. Tell us what your blog is about and what kinds of things people could find there.
So, when President Obama came into office, over a decade ago now, he promised that he was going to go through the federal budget line by line and cut out the programs that we didn't need or were wasteful. Well, of course, Obama didn't do that at all, but it gave us the idea, Cato, to set up a website that has a basic essay on each federal government, major government agency, from Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, and all the big agencies here, and explain why the agency is bloated, why the programs don't work very well, and has recommendations for how to downsize them. So that's the idea with downsizinggovernment.org.
Well, I agree that we do need that. Some of the other things you talked about in your October 29th blog from the Cato Institute was corporate welfare. A lot of what's contained in the Build Back Better plan amounts to corporate welfare, where their federal government is picking winners and losers. Are there good examples that you can point to there?
Well, the best example of this corporate welfare is the new subsidies for electric vehicles. Electric vehicles may be the future in America. The cars are getting better and better. I tend to like gas-powered cars, but we should let consumers choose. So the federal government already subsidizes electric vehicles, as most of your viewers know. But the infrastructure bill included $7 billion to build EV charging stations across the nation. But you can just Google and find out that there are already about 30,000 EV charging stations across the nation. If you go to your local Walmart or Target, you'll see in the parking lot whole lines of EV chargers. So the private sector is already doing this. We don't need more government subsidies for electric vehicles. This is an example of what economists call crowding out. When the government comes in and subsidizes something, it pushes out the private sector activity. Well, we don't need that. We don't need more government subsidies for electric vehicles. If they're better than gas-powered vehicles, well, we should let the market figure that out. So there's a lot of new subsidies like that the Democrats are passing, like new subsidies for the electric utility industry, for example. We don't need that. We should keep the government out of private sector business.
My husband and I aren't really sort of we're not all in on the green or the electric vehicles. I mean, it's not really, it's not important to us. However, my husband has started telling me, hey, I think we ought to look at these electric cars, and not because of sort of the environmental issues, but just because he thinks they're cool. He's like, they look cool. I like the designs. I kind of like what I'm hearing about them. And so that's an example of, I think, just the markets determining what people will want. You don't need the government telling you what's good or dictating to you what you ought to buy. I think individual consumers out there, like my husband, who haven't necessarily been on board with any of this sort of environmental message associated with electric vehicles, people like him are like, these look kind of cool. It might save us some money. Let's look into it.
That's right. There's a lot of examples of that, of where the free market system has moved us towards more environmentally sound practices. So, for example, natural gas prices have come down in recent decades as American drilling technologies have improved and undercut coal and for electricity production, for example. And this has happened all over the world. So, natural gas, which is much cleaner than coal, has come to the fore because of market forces. So solar panels, for example, the government has subsidized those things for a long time. But the real reason why solar power has really taken off is because the price of the photovoltaic cells has plunged over the decades as competition has increased. These panels are manufactured all over the world now. There's intense competition, and that has pushed prices down and made them more attractive for consumers. So that's fine. So let's let the market make these innovations that end up being good for the environment, and that's good for everybody.
And the last thing I want to ask you about are in this massive spending bill, the increased potential for fraud, waste, and abuse, and then that goes along with that is the poor performance and the accountability of so many of these federal programs. Would you address that issue?
Well, one of the huge problems with federal government programs is they get enacted, And then, federal policymakers are not, all-knowing, brilliant central planners and angels. Their programs have a lot of failures and problems, and Congress should go back and fix some of their failed programs. But they virtually never do this because politicians who support programs never want to admit that there's any mistakes with them. So you get failed programs that carry on decade after decade, causing distortions, and they never get fixed. And this is one of the advantages of an act. If you want bigger government programs, at least do it at the state level. So if the programs, cause a lot of damage, at least state legislatures are able to fix them. So, with federal government programs, like the earned income tax credit is a good example. That program it's about a $70 or $80 billion program now. It's a spending program. It's had a fraud and error rate of around 25% for decades and decades, and they don't make a serious effort to fix the problem. But we saw, as I mentioned, with pandemic handout programs last year, like the big expanded unemployment insurance benefits, there was enormous fraud in these programs, but Congress never gets around to fixing them. They just keep spending more and more money. It's really, so I think it's extremely unfair to taxpayers that Congress enacts these programs. They work poorly. There's a huge amount of waste, and then they're never fixed. It's really unfair to taxpayers.
Well, I think that your message is right on. So I appreciate your time, your expertise today. And if you like what you're seeing here at Americans for Limited Government, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Help us get our message out. And thank you to Chris Edwards from the Cato Institute. You can check him out or see what he's writing about at downsizinggovernment.org, or go to the Cato Institute and check out all of the great stuff they're writing about there. So thank you very much. We appreciate your time, Chris, and we'll close this out with a quick little outro video.